He's the one and only James E. Cornette. Mr. Cornette, welcome back to the Two-Man Power Trip.
And an unprecedented fourth time, because nobody has been stupid enough to do this 4 times, is what you're saying.
No, you beat out a couple.
You've hornswoggled somebody for 3, but nobody's been stupid enough to come back for 4 helpings of this type of treatment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly right. Number 3, we're on the cusp with a couple, but you took the bait. I got to say, John hoodwinked you again and got you back for number 4.
I've been bamboozled, hornswoggled even.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're so happy to have you back. And there's always something going on with you, and there's always some cool stuff floating around, and there's a lot of stuff we want to touch on tonight. But I want to kind of talk about this Kickstarter that you had going here with this Jim Cornette Presents Behind the Curtain, the Real Pro Wrestling Stories. Now, we don't have to help you fund it because this thing literally blew out of the water in 24 hours. So our job here is already done, so you're welcome. But just tell us a little bit about this. This is an awesome project with you and IDW. IDW, if nobody knows, has just brought back to the forefront in the graphic novel world some of your favorites like G.I. Joe and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the Ghostbusters and all these great titles. But now you're teaming up with them for this great project.
Well, yeah, I was a comic book collector when I was just a little kid. I started with some classic Marvels from the early 60s that I got from my cousins when I was at my aunt's house and bored when I was like 6 years old. And it became an obsession. I was obsessed with comics even before I was obsessed with wrestling. Of course, there's one thing that's in common in my life is I'm always obsessed with something. But anyway, so now, 50 years later, here we are. The rest is history, as they say. IDW reached out and contacted me. The artist and writer behind the Andre the Giant Closer to Heaven graphic novel, Brandon Easton and Dennis Medry, are the team that's working on it. And everybody just really clicked right off the bat, and we thought we want to keep these stories alive. It's stories not only for wrestling fans, but also because of the nature of them, they're more, truth is more incredible than fiction, as they say. And these stories are interesting to people that aren't wrestling fans, whether it's, the story of how Sputnik Monroe desegregated, was responsible for desegregating sporting events in the South, or whether it was the story of Ric Flair's plane crash, or the behind-the-scenes take on Jerry Lawler and Andy Kaufman that people still talk about 35 years later. Whatever, from all eras of wrestling, going back to the pioneer days, and it blew up, like you said. We funded it in 24 hours. Then we hit the first stretch goal in like 3 days. And so far we've added, I think it's 16 or 20 pages total to the book. I've lost track. Plus the Kickstarter, if we reach the next level, which we're almost there, and it'll be the final one, we close up on Thursday night, the 17th. But then the Kickstarter folks get a hardcover edition of the graphic novel. And there's a special collector's UV treatment on the covers of the regular editions. And there's a bookmark. And the artists are doing sketches of me and the Midnight Express and just for lithographs, all kinds of cool stuff. But anyway, you don't have much time. But if you want to jump in on it, it's tinyurl.com/corny Kickstarter. And we're going to bring it home strong, but that's going to be toward the fall or winter time. The finished product will be out, and we've had a lot of great feedback on it. Obviously, people have been turning cartwheels. So that's one of the many things that I'm trying to do to keep me off the streets at night. Keep me home and employed. The podcasts are doing well. The Experience and Drive Through both hit their record months for downloads in the month of April. We pretty much hit about 750,000 downloads, which is ridiculous. From 2 years ago, I was saying I added up all the listenership of the podcast and made a big deal that by November we were going to have had 1 million downloads that year, right? And about 3 years later, now it's 750,000 for the month of April. But at the YouTube channel, corny YouTube, by the way, tinyurl.com/corny YouTube. I love those tiny URLs. The YouTube numbers are blowing up. People want to hear about these stories about wrestling, and for whatever reason, my take on a variety of things. I just found out there's formaldehyde in baby powder. And I had stern words for the people who did that on one of the latest Jim Cornette experiences. So that you never know what's going to come up.
Oh, I know from the YouTube perspective, I know just from when we clip our show and we put something up. I mean, it's like instantly you start to see you start to see the response in the people, and they get so like, I mean, they start arguing, they start fighting in the comments of YouTube videos. But your podcast, I mean, look, I'm not going to blow smoke up your fanny just because you're on the line, but it's
Well,
one.
I sincerely hope you won't try to do it whether we're speaking on the phone or not.
But I mean, it's one of the.
That could be dangerous. That's worse than formaldehyde and baby powder. Smoke up the fanny.
It's one of the only shows that I'll listen to outside of doing this show, just because I never know what the people are going to send in to ask you, and kind of never know what you're going to say next in terms of maybe a story that you've told once before, but maybe you throw a little nugget back in about something else. I mean, your podcasts have taken on a life of their own, and obviously they're evolving even more as we speak. As you kind of start to move
My podcast has almost turned into like that creeping green crud that infested Stephen King and Creepshow.
That's a great reference, but it's so cool to see. And I mean, obviously, I don't know what you thought you were going to get into when you did podcasting originally, but obviously the drive-through, the experience, is this everything you ever thought and more, basically, where you're at this point with it?
I just started the podcast as a way to meet girls. I don't really know what it. No, I mean, actually, it just we started it because it was just something to do to tell some stories and connect with my really devoted fans, both of them. And then, like I said, suddenly it started blowing up with a lot of, and sometimes, like you said, we talk about things that aren't related to wrestling, and that gets as much, if not more, consternation and reprobation and feedback as the wrestling stuff, especially when I take on, a terrorist organization like the NRA or the, treasonous Republicans that intend to bring an end to our way of life and destroy the global economy again, and just things like that.
We know, we definitely know that you definitely don't shy away from anything. And in our secondary show that we do with Shane Douglas, we've shied away from the politics. But you and Shane, I mean, look, you want to talk about dream matches?
Oh my God! The last time I talked to him, I thought he was serious until I realized he was just winding me up, and there's no way that anybody could love that buffoonish orange orangutan that's in our White House. So, but I thought for a minute Shane was serious, that he had lost his mind. One of those errant chair shots from Bobby Eaton in 1989 had scrambled his brains. But then I realized he was just winding me up. And I'm sure Shane is as devoted a democratic socialist as I am.
Yeah, maybe you get him on the line, you'll ask him that, he'll have an answer for you. But yeah, that's a WrestleMania main event in the making, is the two of you on both sides for a political debate. But that's a different story for a different day. I want to stick with the podcast here. So now, you've gone on and you're moving away from MLW, from what it looks like. And what's going to be going on next with the experience in the drive-thru? I mean, you've created this world that your fans and the cult of Cornette have kind of responded to. So what's next here for Jim Cornette?
Well, and now don't start gossip amongst the folks as to me and MLW. I've been friends with Court Bauer for some time, and we're cool, but I've been under the MLW umbrella for some time. But recently we made the announcement a couple weeks ago. We've gone out on we're an outlaw podcast now. We're independent. We've gone out on our own, and there's no heat with Court, and he made the same announcement that he thanked me for my 5 happy years, and I thanked him for the platform. But I just noticed that Brian Last, my co-host, and we don't play well with others, and sometimes people that are associated with me get the residual heat, and sometimes I'm associated with other people in groups that I don't necessarily see eye to eye with. So I like to do my own thing now. As I mentioned a few years ago, I got out of the wrestling business and in the Jim Cornette business. And so we're going independent with the podcast, just because that way we stand or fall on our own merits. If anybody is grouped with me, and I cause, like terroristic threats to come down on people, it's, now it'll only affect me, and vice versa. Sometimes there's one SOB in every crowd, and you're always in there with a group with somebody that you're like, so I'm staying away from group things, doing my own thing.
The podcast world is quite the cutthroat world, and everybody's got a podcast now. If you've got a voice, you can throw on a recorder, you can publish it, you do whatever you want with it. But I kind of find it interesting when other wrestling personalities get involved and they start to kind of go back and forth. And I'm not saying you with anybody specifically, just in general, that the podcasting platform with the wrestling personalities has almost taken on, a feud like it would in the wrestling ring, where it kind of, develops one comment here, one comment there, and then it's like all out war, unfolding right in front of your eyes, or in this case, your ears.
Well, yeah, that's the thing with a podcast now. The people like to listen to the podcast more than they like to watch the wrestling shows because they know that the podcasts are the only thing that are real. That's where the guys are really saying what they really mean. If you're in a wrestling television program or on a wrestling show these days, they think, that's all bullshit. But on the podcast, that stuff's real. So there you have it.
Now, lately in the news, obviously, Cody Rhodes is coming up a lot, and All In is coming up, and they sold out. And I know you made a comment on, you're pretty proud that Cody was able to do that, and it's pretty impressive. But what are your real thoughts on, that promotion, Cody, the Bucks, and then being able to sell out that arena of 10,000 people in Chicago?
Well, I've talked extensively about it this week on the experience. Even personal feelings aside about some of the people on the show, because it's no secret that the Kenny Omega and the Bucks are nice kids. I've worked with them before, but they've just gone so far into just bullshit wrestling. Just whether it's wrestling competitively with grade schoolers or invisible men or blow up dolls or little girls, whatever the case may be, this whole phase or fad, it took us 15 years to get over that hardcore shit that ECW foisted on us. And then everything was hardcore and it, that was the hot thing of the moment. And it did a lot of damage to the business and the boys in it. And it took us finally 15 years and we got over it. And now people are, that hardcore shit again. But now they're doing phony bullshit entertainment wrestling with invisible men and hand grenades and shit. And that's going to be worse for the business in the long run. And of course, now everybody's saying, Cornette said, they just sold 10,000 tickets and he's saying it's horrible for the business. That's what it's come to. I'm glad that Cody got genes from the Dream. The Dream was the big idea guy. The Dream was the big concept guy, Starrcade, the Great American Bash. So I'm not surprised that Cody saw this and kind of had a dustiest reaction to it. And those guys are hot and they have a devoted audience. And I've said it a million times, for people who like that kind of thing, that's the kind of thing those people like. It's become now a situation where that people, it was a hold my beer moment where the people are disgruntled with the WWF domination of the business. They are fiercely loyal to the Bucks and the Omegas and the Bullet Club guys. It was the ultimate, and this is not a knock, because it was amazing that they were able to see this and capitalize on it and do something that nobody else in the business has ever done before, ever. And that doesn't happen too often. For guys to finance their own show, run their own show, and do a ticket sale like that instantly. It was the ultimate crowdfunding moment in wrestling. I guarantee you that those people lined up to buy the tickets, even if they can't be there, because they wanted to be part of history and they wanted to help those guys cross the finish line. And that's a tremendous tribute to how over they are with their audience, whether I agree with the kind of wrestling they do or not. And I don't. That's why I don't do more wrestling shows these days, because I can't bring myself to it. I mentioned on the show, if it became a thing to start sodomizing the family pet, I still probably wouldn't be buggering my Pomeranian. But, I can't be associated with wrestling like that, where guys just do portrayals and performances, in the ring with foolishness and stuffed animals, because people now know it's all a show. I guess that's what's gotten so much heat with me on these guys, or heat with these guys with me, is that their fans all go, well, it's wrestling. It's supposed to be silly and humorous and fun, and nobody's supposed to take it seriously because it's wrestling. And they believe that because that's the generation that they've grown up with. And they think somehow when people found out, they think the only difference between wrestling of today and wrestling of 30 years ago is that people found out that it was all a work. That's far from the only difference. It's not presented seriously anymore. The guys won't do anything to protect the business. So therefore, I just can't be involved in it because I can't lend my tacit approval to, to guys doing stuff like that. But that audience is powerful, as we've seen. And they sold out the tickets. They were able to work in conjunction with Ring of Honor. They were able to, in effect, rent a wrestling office for the infrastructure because it's the guys, individually, they weren't set up with Ticketmaster. They didn't have, I don't know what all the deal is with Ring of Honor, but I would imagine they were useful in finding insurance for the event and in setting up with Ticketmaster and executing contracts for merchandise sales or obviously TV promotion. They were able to get tremendous social media behind them because they're, once again, the exact age group where all of those people are on Twitter. And all of them are they live on their phones. I don't even have a smartphone, but these people can't, they're on it, so they're wired in. And they just, every box they tick, they didn't. I told my audience when they first announced they were going to do a 10,000 seat building, not where or when or whatever, just the concept. And I had mentioned I thought Chicago would be the best place, which is advantageous because they've got Pro Wrestling Tees there for publicity, and it's in the middle of the country, but it's an airport hub, easy to get to. They've got a holiday weekend, an extra weekend for people to travel. The podcast convention that Conrad's doing has started to take on a life. So it's like a WrestleMania weekend of festivities for people. But that's, they've been able to do that as the boys and still have all those things fall into place for them. It's never been possible for guys to run their own show at that level like that with all of those, advantages. And they knocked it out of the park. And also the thing is, to be honest, and I mean, tell me if you believe this is true, if you don't agree, if any promotion in the world ran this exact same show with the exact same talent, called the exact same thing, but it wasn't the boys themselves running it, would it have done a quarter of this advanced sale? Even no. WWE, TNA, yeah. Ring of Honor, New Japan in the United States, any other company, it's because it was the boys. They are supporting the team is in need, and they did it and knocked it out of the park. I wish you could have 20 years ago. I wish I could have made the wrestling promotion that baby face with Smoky Mountain. We'd still be in business, but it wasn't possible then. So anyway, it's going to be a big deal.
Now, I was thinking about the StarCast thing that Conrad has, and it's blown up and it's big. It's weird though. One huge omission from it is you. Is there? Were you invited? Are you going? Are you doing it? Like, are we allowed to? Are we allowed to even talk about it?
Well, no. Well, yes, we're allowed to talk about anything except my personal bank account number. No, as a matter of fact, I mentioned this on my show also. Maybe we ought to just play the tape of my show. No, I'm not trying to. Conrad called me when he first had the idea. He hadn't really announced the podcast convention yet, but he contacted me and said, "Hey, would you like to be a part of it?" And I told him, it is not even being pissy. I told him no, because that's not my audience. I mean, I'm sure there would be a number of people that listen to my show that go to this show or would want to meet me or whatever. But in whole, it's not my audience. And more importantly, for the people who do not like James E. anyway, and are not fond of me, they'd be going, "Oh, now look at Cornette. He knocks those guys, but when there's a big convention around their show, he's got to jump in on it and get a payoff." I don't need the payoff. Therefore, I said, no, I don't think I fit. I don't want to be in a big group and a big bunch of podcasts. I'm going independent. Don't want to be part of a crowd. Want to do my own thing. And that was fine. But once again, it just goes to show the lack of awareness of a certain individual as to how hated he is when I politely declined because I said it's not my thing to be around a bunch of fans of the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, and they probably don't want to see me. But they try to ask Shitstain, and the blow up is such from the fans and the talent that he's off the thing in 20. But he actually accepted. Why would he think that any of those fans would want to see him at all? Why does he think anybody wants to see him at all to begin with? Even his immediate family, that's a question. But that he did not know that he would not be welcome in that environment. At least if I took the booking, I'd go in intending to be a heel, but it'd probably be the wrong kind of heat. So anyway.
Now, as far as the relationship with Cody? I know obviously you like Big Dust, but any sort of relationship with Cody at all?
Actually, since he was, minute as a small boy, I've run into Cody just a couple of times because, he was tied up with the WWE for quite some time. But I'm going to say we saw him in England at the shows that What Culture, I believe, ran a year and a half ago, and have run into him a couple of times. And, he's a great kid. He looks fantastic. He's always dressed up. He looks like a pro. Great kid. The matches I've seen him have, he's talented. He thankfully cosmetically looks like a better athlete than Dusty, but he inherited Dusty's great athletic genes because Dusty was a hell of a football player and a baseball player and etc. So I haven't worked with Cody a bunch, but I've enjoyed visiting with him when I have.
Now, in this event, I don't know if you know, but he'll be challenging for the NWA World title. I don't know if you saw that or what your thoughts are on not only him challenging for the NWA World title, which is pretty damn ironic in Chicago and everything else. I mean, all that is very ironic. What do you think about the NWA kind of coming back? Is it kind of passe, kind of weird that Billy Corgan is redoing the NWA?
Well, it's not really weird. The NWA was at one point passe, just because the whole concept, the whole idea of the original NWA was a group of promoters that had different territories that would band together to squash opposition, to be quite frank, and to trade talent and to respect boundaries and et cetera, et cetera. And they were all kind of on even keels. Of course, Kansas City didn't carry quite as much weight as the Carolinas, except Harley was a part owner of Kansas City, so it carried some weight, but you know what I mean? They were the modern promotions that were joining the NWA under the old method is just local guys, a lot of them not with television. They were trying to get the name NWA to make them mean something rather than because they were all strong wrestling promotions making the name NWA mean something. It was putting the cart before the horse. And now I haven't talked to Billy Corgan extensively about what he's doing, but it's obvious he's got the NWA. He's taken a step back. He's trying to create a little interest in the championship. They're doing the online videos. I don't believe he's going to have member promoters. I believe the NWA will be an entity of some description. And I think that's probably the best way to do it. And as far as Cody challenging, it's perfect. Because Cody Rhodes, the son of the American Dream, a former NWA champion, on the biggest independent show ever done in the history of God, challenges for the NWA championship. It's perfect because it's perfect for Cody, and it's also perfect for the NWA to be high profile with a new and a younger audience in a different incarnation. And boy, howdy, I hope he wins it, is all I'll say.
Yeah, it could be some really good press for that if he does win the title. Now, I want to kind of dial it back to Shane Douglas here and mention that your co-host Brian Last and Mike Mills from Booking the Territory did a show not too long ago about the night Shane Douglas threw down the NWA Championship in 1993 as part of the NWA title tournament. Now, we've covered that on the Triple Threat podcast with Shane, and in kind of looking at stuff, I don't think I've ever heard you comment on that. So what was going through Jim Cornette's mind when Shane threw that title down back in 1993? Obviously, you had ties to Dennis Carluzzo, so what was going through your head when he threw that title down?
Well, I was hot because it was bullshit, and everybody knows it was bullshit. And I don't blame Shane so much because he was disgruntled because his run in WCW had ended much like most of ours had ended in WCW. We were pissed off. At least we got to have a main event run before they came in and screwed up our careers. But the guys like Shane that came in under Turner, they just screwed their careers up first. But Paulie talked him into doing that shit or whatever. I'd never sat down and talked with Shane extensively about it, probably because I didn't want to get mad at Shane. So I'm just going to blame Paulie because anytime anything nefarious happened, it was usually Paul behind it. But they should have just not been involved. Paul should have just not been involved in the NWA and lied to all those people and fucking, did that shit if he was going to make their belt look bad. It made Dennis Corluzzo look bad, which Paul loved doing. And I'm sure Todd Gordon loved doing, because Dennis was the NWA representative and the guy that was there at the tournament. but it made the belt look bad. It was disrespectful. And all the other promoters that had agreed to work with him, that was Paul's idea of becoming outlaw and creating, and I'd say it to his face. He was a piece of shit for doing that. He should have just gone on and done his own belt and left the fucking NWA alone if that's the best he could come up with. But instead he pulls that shit. That's why I immediately called Dennis and offered all my Smoky Mountain talent, whoever he wanted, to come up to Jersey. And when we redid the tournament to crown a new NWA champion, because I wanted to help however I could get him out of the mess that Heyman put him into.
Yeah, and that tournament itself is another one. In the history books, you go back and look at the talent that was on both of the tournaments. And I said 93, I meant 94 when I mentioned that. But you look at the...
I'll let you get back.
Just let me slide. Let me slide. But August, obviously, for the first one with Shane, and then the other one, I think it was October, correct, if I'm wrong here. But still, the two tournaments themselves featuring that kind of talent. And when Shane threw that belt on the ground, I mean, I don't know if the NWA belt recovered up until maybe it started to resurface, when Jeff Jarrett and NWA TNA brought it back in the early 2000s. But do you think
it was more important? But when Dan Severn carried it, it was more important than it was. Because let's face it, it wasn't particularly that important at the time when the ECW tournament was done, or the ECW flavored tournament was done. Because at that point, WCW was in such disarray, and they were the last ones that had used it. And I think that's almost at the point where they stopped running house shows completely. So when Dan Severn carried it to the Octagon on the early UFC pay-per-view, and when there was a real legitimate athlete traveling with it, when the different promoters would bring him in and use him, at that point it became more important than it was in the 93, 94 time period. And then, when the NWA ended up being mentioned on Raw, it got him a lot more member promoters, but it didn't really get him that many more fans because of obviously the way that the whole thing was a rib by Russo to make us all look like idiots. That's why they foisted it off on us. And I, said yes to the whole thing, trying to be a team player. But it just, it made everybody, the NWA invasion of WWF made everybody in the NWA look like idiots because they obviously rushed through the matches. They presented all the guys as losers that could only beat each other. And it wasn't ever meant to get any of those guys over. It was meant to make me look bad because that's, as Russo has said, that was supposedly the wrestling I was pulling for. And I was pulling for good wrestling, which we didn't get it with the NWA invasion or the shit that he was booking, either one. But he's concocted this narrative that I was constantly bugging them to bring these guys in and constantly bugging them to do old-fashioned wrestling. I was avoiding at that point speaking to them to see if they'd ignore me. So I didn't want to be on the TV show. I didn't want to be on the fucking cards. They would call me with the new Midnight Express. Oh God. All right. Or can you get a hold of the NWA? We'd like to bring their belt in for Jeff or whatever. All right. It was, nobody can tell me that he wasn't doing it that bad on purpose, because nobody can do shit that bad unless it's on purpose. Couldn't be accidental.
I personally love seeing Rock and Roll Express and Barry Windham, and even then when Severn would come in a few months later, I just love seeing that flavor in the WWF at that point. But I just want to go back to Shane here.
Well, imagine if we'd ever done anything interesting.
No, it would have been unbelievable. But now let's take the ECW part of the NWA title tournament out of it. If Shane was to become the NWA champion at that point in 1994, what do you think Shane could have done for the belt if he just went through with it and was the NWA champion?
I think he was Shane of all of the guys in the Northeast was the best guy to hold the NWA title, because he was I know I'm going to piss somebody off because I'm not going to remember somebody or whatever. But at that point, at that time of the Northeast guys, Shane was the most, I thought, well-rounded worker. At the time, he was still young and athletic, but we were all still young and maybe athletic in my case. But he was young. He was a good-looking kid. He could cut a pretty good promo. He was a good all-around worker. He would have done well with the traditional NWA title, where he would go to the different promotions and wrestle the local guy, and he'd probably be able to pull it off because he could have a match with a different variety of people. So, I mean, that would have been great if they'd have done it right, or just do their own belt. I'm not saying that ECW had to just use the NW, because that would have led to more issues anyway. If once they got a little bit more television, ECW, and they had the NWA champion, and especially with the stuff they were doing on TV, a lot of the NWA promoters would have not wanted the champion doing shit like that on television. So it's always better they had their own belt, but they just shouldn't have, they just shouldn't have stabbed people in the back to do it. But that's Paul.
Now, did you really like Shane Douglas because you loved managing the Dynamic Dudes at one point?
Oh, good Lord. I felt so sorry for Shane, because it's like he had a heat magnet attached to his hip. Shane, even the Dudes was a horrible gimmick. The fluorescent colors and the skateboards and the backwards baseball caps and everything. It was rotten. But Shane was a good enough worker, and as a babyface, when you'd get heat on him and he'd sell down south, he'd still get the people behind him. But then Laurinaitis would tag in and just klutz the whole fucking thing up. And up north, they had no chance. People didn't like either one of them. There was the famous night in Philadelphia where we're getting heat on fucking Johnny Ace for once, right? And Shane's going to make the comeback. But they got Johnny in the ring, and the people start chanting while they're getting heat on him on the babyface, "Johnny sucks dick. Johnny sucks dick." And we look up, and hanging from the bleachers is a big bed sheet, and they've spray painted on it with black spray paint, "Johnny sucks Shane's dick." That's where the people picked up on it, started chanting that. And so, Shane was in there all by himself. Anyway, so yeah, that was not the greatest gimmick in the world.
Now, obviously, the Midnight Express, I mean, they could really carry anybody and just work a really good match with anybody. Was that one of those things where it's like, okay, like we're going to try to push these guys to make them look good? Or is it one of those things where it kind of falls on the Midnight Express? It's like, okay, we're going to throw you in there with anybody. You better have a good match with these guys.
Well, no, I think JR wanted to push the Dudes, but Herd hated us and didn't want to hear any ideas involving the Midnight Express. And that's why we ended up working with the Dynamic Dudes, because I had pitched us doing an angle with the Steiners because we had great matches with Steiners. And I pitched somebody else and blah, blah, blah. And basically, the Dynamic Dudes were the only other team that Herd didn't give a shit what happened to. So that's how he's okay. If you're going to take both the Midnight Express and the Dynamic Dudes, fine, let them work together. That way I don't have to listen to this shit. And that's how we, ended up working with the Dynamic Dudes.
Now, Jim Herd, obviously, as a guy you don't really like too much, he ended up quitting because of him. What was their relationship like with you and him, or was it just totally non-existent?
No, it existed. We hated each other. He was constantly grumping at me, and I was constantly wanting to gouge his eyeballs out. So that was our relationship.
What was it with him? Like the story, basically, obviously you would know, besides some rumors and people putting stuff together. But what was the reason behind really putting him in charge of Turner? Was it just ineptitude on their part? Like, why did they think him, of all people, a guy from Pizza Hut, would be able to control WCW?
What I had always been told, and have in 30 years have not heard another version of the story, was that Jack Petrick, who was the Turner Broadcasting executive that was put in charge of the division that the wrestling company would fall under, his wife was friends with Herd's wife. And Herd from St. Louis, and this was 1988 now, mind you, in the mid-late 60s, had been a studio director for KPLR TV Channel 11 in St. Louis and had directed the wrestling show for Sam Muchnick. So somehow... And that was back in the days when they didn't even smarten the technical crew up that wrestling was a work, and it was the most basic of TV wrestling shows. And somehow, because of that wrestling background, the guy who had currently been a Pizza Hut executive was suddenly put in charge of the second largest wrestling company in North America, to spectacular results. And I'm not even kidding.
Unbelievable that, the inner politics and the inner workings of sometimes the wrestling business is just almost crazier than the
actually, no. When you think of
this
wasn't the inner workings and politics of the wrestling business. This was the inner workings, politics, and incompetence of Turner Broadcasting, the company that we thought, well, oh my God, we've got great wrestlers, we've got great wrestling TV, we've have all these fans all across the country. If we just had the bottomless pockets to fight Vince, now that Turner Broadcasting has bought us, we got everything. And they just within a year and a half, they dismantled the whole fucking ball of wax. It was amazing.
That is a great point. I mean, obviously Turner Broadcasting kind of shit the bed a bit, and obviously they weren't doing their part to help WCW when you had all that amazing talent. I mean, that roster was unbelievable. And when you get a guy like Jim Cornette and a guy like Stan Lane to get up and quit and walk out, that's pretty much saying a lot right there. It's almost saying, like, how are we losing these guys? Well, it's your fault. Whoever's in charge is really ruining it.
We weren't the only ones. He ran the Road Warriors and Paul Ellering off. Then he ran us off twice. We'd quit once and they talked us into coming back. But he ran us off twice. Flair quit as Booker and then later on quit completely and went to the WWF because of Jim Hurt. I mean, there's other people in there, but he had quite a run there of running off some of the biggest name talent in the business.
Crazy, all the guys that would leave and then end up with Vince at one point. But starting Smoky Mountain, I know we talked about this before, briefly, but starting Smoky Mountain, was that something always on your mind? Always that you wanted to start your own promotion? Did that big territory create that thing? Was that always in your mind, in the back of your head, as you're doing all this other thing? Announcing, commentating, managing?
Oh God, no. Actually, what technically was in my mind up until Crockett sold to Turner Broadcasting was one day I will book Mid-Atlantic Wrestling. I will book Crockett Promotions. After Dusty is retired and living on the beach, baby, somewhere down there. Yes, I will do this one day. And then, of course, that became impossible. But then I thought, well, then when Flair actually got me on the booking committee in WCW for that period of time, I thought, okay, because I always wanted to do that because the money to be made in wrestling all those years was in booking. And that's how ass backwards it is now. In the old days, the promoter and the booker made the majority of the money. That's what you wanted to aspire to if you were one of the boys and you were smart. You wanted to be figured in as the booker in a major territory, or you wanted to be a part owner of something. And that was the way to regular, steady, and good money. And you could make a lot. Now the promoters and the bookers are the last ones to make any money. They pay the wrestlers a fortune in some cases. Anyway, once that Turner Broadcasting took over and I had that stint on the booking committee and then, Hurd was there, then Flair was gone and we were gone, etc. I was riding in the car with the Midnight Express and, usually Stan or Bobby would drive to the town and I might drive back or whatever. That way they could drink after the matches. So during the day, I'd read the road atlas in the back seat for something to do. And I started looking at, old territories, and I started looking at places that could be territories. And I started looking, and we had gone to Knoxville for WCW, and I'd seen they were still drawing there. When they couldn't draw a house anywhere else, they were still drawing in Knoxville until they screwed that up with all the no-shows. But it gave me the idea, and I started looking at the atlas, and then I said, well, maybe this could work. And then a friend of mine introduced me to Rick Rubin when he came to Atlanta to work on a record deal with the Black Crowes. And he was big fans of mine and Flair. And we started talking, and I said, would you ever be interested in backing a wrestling promotion? He said, yes, I would. And that's when I had the idea for Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I had to make my own territory because there were none left available. So that's kind of how that came up. Because at that point, I would have almost quit wrestling. I wouldn't have been able to afford to go back and work Memphis, and that was the last territory left. So I would have pretty much had to quit wrestling if I hadn't started Smoky Mountain.
It is crazy that Rick Rubin, of all people, is associated with Jim Cornette as far as starting Smoky Mountain. You ever look back and it's like, wow, that's an odd pairing you wouldn't really necessarily think about on paper?
Oh, yeah, it was always hilarious to us, and just the idea. But at the same time, Rick was a Yankee from New York that had moved to Hollywood and made a bunch of money, but he loved old time Southern wrestling, especially because that was the stuff that was more believable. If you look at it, Rick, when he produced artists, It was Johnny Cash stripped away the phony Hollywood veneer that had been surrounded him and went back to the artist and the guy, the root of Johnny Cash, the man in black. He would always he'd produce guys by unproducing them, by letting their talent show through and letting the realism and the grit. And he told me one time, he said, if you're not offending somebody, you're not doing it right. So, the idea of this classic American performance art that was being lost appealed to him to keep it. He didn't want, the clownishness of 90s WWF with face paint and, fucking Matilda the Bulldog. He wanted the real shit.
Very cool. If you think about Smoky Mountain, even watching it now, I still enjoy it because it's the last territory, really, if you really think about it. So many good guys in and out of there, so many talent, was developed in Smoky Mountain. So many guys, the Canes of the world, the Al Snows of the world, D'Lo Brown. I mean, so many different guys. Did you look at it when you first started it as a feeder territory for the WWF, or were you thinking more, in-house, this is my territory, these are my guys, I'm going to build it for us?
Oh, well, yes. See, at first we weren't affiliated with anybody. So yes, it was all I was about. This is, and I was always about, this is our territory. I'm going to build this for us. But at first there was the deal with WCW real briefly when Bill Watts came back to run things, was trying to right the ship until, that bunch of pussy fucking wrestlers that they had at that point, if they'd had to work for Bill Watts at Mid-South Wrestling when he was the real boss instead of just the hired boss that didn't have all the pull, if they think WCW they were all crying and cringing, he brought the losses from like $8 million the previous year to like $400,000, which is what he was brought in to do. But he didn't have time to really make any inroads. But we were going to have, that's why the Heavenly Bodies and the Rock and Roll and I were on Super Brawl that year, and why Bob Eaton and Arn Anderson were in Smoky Mountain. We were going to start a talent trade and working on some different things, and he didn't stay long enough for us to do that. And then later on that year, we got the call from the WWF. And I didn't look at it as a feeder system per se. I knew that we were going to be feeding talent to the WWF, which was fine, because why not? That's a carrot to dangle in front of guys. If you come to work in Smoky Mountain Wrestling and you impress everybody and you look good, the people in the WWF are seeing the TV, and the booker is working on all their TVs and pay-per-views. So you think that'll be a handy thing? Yeah, probably. So it made it easier for us to get talent maybe that we wanted, or for people to pay attention to us. And then we got national name talent to come in and work with our guys and work with them competitively and on their level. So it made our guys look like bigger names.
And if you think about it, when you get the guys like The Undertaker down there, and they're giving you talent as well, it does nothing but benefit Smoky Mountain. So it's pretty amazing when you get a guy, right, like Undertaker, and they kind of, loan him to you, or, like they give him to you for a couple bookings.
But yeah, and the great thing was, at the time, Mark lived in Nashville. So it was like 3 hours over in the car. Poor Percy, Paul Bearer, had to fly from Mobile to make the Knoxville show. But Taker, and he was friends with Brian Lee at the time, and Brian lived in Nashville. So one time in Glasgow, Kentucky, Brian Lee comes in, and the Undertaker was off that week and just rode to the show with him at the high school gym in Glasgow, Kentucky. There's 350, 400 people there, and in walks Brian Lee with the Undertaker. But the Undertaker goes to the locker room, stays there the rest of the night, nobody ever sees him again. Biggest star in wrestling's in the building. But but anyway, and Mark kind of started in the Memphis territory after he broke in Dallas, and he knew the wrestling business, and he was happy to come and work with. I didn't just have him come and put him against, Joe and Bob in a handicap match just so people could see the Undertaker. When he came in, it was to work with, in one case, Glenn Jacobs as Unabomb, who would later become Kane. I said, okay, here's you an opponent. If you have a good match with him and you think you might want to work with him on pay-per-view, put a word in for Vince. And guess what happened 6 months later? So Mark was coming in to help the territory and to scout opponents for himself and do good business.
Yeah, the rest they say is history, obviously, with Unabomb, a.k.a. Isaac Yankem, a.k.a. Fake Diesel, a.k.a. Kane, the most decorated wrestler possibly in the history of WWE. My God, how long he's been there. But, just kind of touching with the Smoky Mountain to WWF connection. Obviously, besides you and the Heavenly Bodies, would Brian Lee be the first guy that was really plucked from Smoky Mountain to be that, phony Undertaker role in the SummerSlam that 94 year?
Well, with an asterisk, because the reason, once again, he was friends with Taker is the reason why, because they came up with the idea, because Brian was almost the same size, had the long hair, could pull it off, right? And then Brian did a few things that did not endear him to either management or the Undertaker, and so that it was not followed through on after that initial big splash. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you this: one time I'm doing voiceovers on a Raw. I was co-hosting Raw for some reason. While I don't know if it was one of the times Lawler was out or whatever, but we're doing them at the studio. It wasn't a live show, and Vince says, "I need to speak to you, pal." We go, back in the corner away from the audio booth, and he says, "I just wanted you to know that," because they had given Brian some dates around that fake Undertaker thing, and he had come to Vince and he'd said, "Well, I just want you to know I can start full time anytime." And he said, "Well, aren't you working for Cornette down there in Knoxville?" "Yeah, but it doesn't matter." So basically, he came to me and told me, "Hey, Brian Lee just told me he would leave with no notice and finish up on you anytime to come work for me. And I just wanted you to know, because if he'll do it to you to make more money for work for me, then if somebody else offers him more money, he'll do it to me." Which is what the guys never figured out. When you tell a promoter something like that, the first thing they're going to do is, well, they'll fuck me too. So Vince told me about that. Vince decided not to use him. I kind of switched him babyface again, finished him up, and there he was. He was floating around.
Wow, that's something you never think about that. That's almost like, that's like the guy, that's like the Wally Pipp moment with Lou Gehrig. You miss that opportunity. Because it's something that, the promoter saw that, and that's unbelievable. But some of those guys, I mean, we've talked about it with you before. It's just the list of names is unbelievable. But, even on a smaller scale, the fact that, Sonny was obviously able to move up from Smoky Mountain to WWF TV, but we always talk about him. But Chris Candido, I mean, what an underrated guy in the history of the business. He was such a great in-ring wrestler and had such a great personality. Obviously passed away way too soon, but he had such a great run in Smoky Mountain, and moving to, Skip of the Body Don is obviously not what you would consider to be the greatest gimmick in the world. But did he talk to you about Skip and now not really loving that gimmick when he got to the WWF in '95?
Oh God, yes. I mean, you can see it on his face. He looked like somebody had held a steaming turd under his nose. And it was horrible. It was a horrible gimmick. And and then they buried Tom Pritchard when they made him, his partner. It was stupid is what it was, but that was during the 90s. Everybody had to have a profession. There was a garbage man and a hockey player, and here's the fitness, experts, the body donnas. Chris was a tremendous talent and way beyond his age. And he not only could work athletically, but once he got in Knoxville and he started traveling with all those veterans and being around Tom Pritchard and Stan Lane and Jimmy Del Rey and Dirty White Boy and Tracy Smothers and Bob Armstrong and all those guys. Then he started learning psychology and he picked that up so quick. And, he could nail finishes and he could cut promos. He could do just everything. And they just, they brought him up and they said, "Oh, here's this short little guy. He reminds me of that Tony Little. Let's make him a fitness guy," because they didn't take him seriously. And then Sonny pulled out of the pack because they weren't used to that many gorgeous, hot young girls at that point. And, and that once that she got over, then they just left Chris to float. But he was the star of the family and the star of the show, as far as if you were running a wrestling promotion. But since it was a, basically a sideshow circus character moment, it buried him and he was miserable. And I mean, they knew he was miserable too. It's not like he hid it. And I used to tell him, "Hey, at least you're here. Maybe something will happen." But I couldn't come up with that much rosiness to paint it, in a better light for him. He knew it sucked. It sucked. It was horrible. It was obvious.
Now, rebook it. If Chris Candido could go in as Chris Candido in 1995, where do you think he would have fell into the pack with the rest of that roster?
Well, the rest of that roster at that time, once again, everybody was fucking huge. Everybody was huge, whether they could carry it or not, whether they could work or not. Everybody was huge, and he was a little guy. I would have, everybody knows what I would have had a roster more like Smoky Mountain Wrestling rather than to be honest, than a bunch of huge 6'6" guys that were 300 pounds and everybody doing the same shit. I'd had guys that could work and guys that can bump and tried to give them some more action, which is what they ended up doing later on. But it was a horrible time in 95, 96.
When Smoky Mountain ends up closing the door and end up, closing down Smoky Mountain for good, is that one of those things where, you're bitter, upset about it? Or is one of the things where like, oh, thank God this is over. Now I can focus on, the WWF or whatever else you have.
Oh, good Lord. No. And, sometimes people don't even believe me when I say this. The only reason I'd taken the job with the WWF was to make extra money to put back in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. and truthfully and honestly, I'd said, if Smoky Mountain doesn't make it, then fuck it, I'm done with wrestling. But unfortunately, I had to take the job with the WWF because I had shit to pay off from Smoky Mountain so I could get the tapes back and everything from the production company. No, I'm the only person that's ever reluctantly gone to work in the office in Stamford. Well, I don't know about the only person reluctantly, but I didn't want. I asked Vince. I didn't ask Vince. I basically pitched Vince toward Thanksgiving of '95. When our international sales that we were hoping for, the international TV sales of tapes hadn't come through to give us some extra money, and Thanksgiving houses were down or looking like they were going to be down, and so I went to Vince and I said, hey, almost wink, wink. Boy, if I can't come up with a way to get an extra, $5 or $10 a week, maybe, or not even that, $5 or $10 a month, I think it was. I said, I may have to close down by Christmas. And I was thinking he was going to say, well, I've gotten all this talent. I've gotten Candido and Tammy and Al Snow and Glenn Jacobs and this and that. Maybe you'll, kick in a little bit. But what he said, well, if you do, let me know, because I'd love to have you come up and work on the creative team full time. I'm like, Newman, God damn it. That's not what I said. So now I was going to have to close down, but I had a job offer. So I had to go because I had to pay all these things off. So I reluctantly, gritting my teeth and clenching my ass, moved to Connecticut to work and it just wasn't a fit. I just couldn't stand it there. After the disappointment of Smoky Mountain Wrestling, I won't say I didn't do my best work in the WWF. I always tried hard to do whatever. I tried too hard to do whatever I was supposed to do. That's part of the problem. But I never wanted to be there. I didn't like the style of wrestling. I didn't want to be involved in sports entertainment. I liked the idea of being able to get guys over and get them jobs. But, I never wanted to do it. And that's why pretty much as soon as I got there, I started looking for an escape route. And then when I ran into Danny Davis here in Louisville when I was visiting about a year and a half later and saw his school and saw that their developmental program needed a major – well, they didn't have a developmental program at the time. Tom Pritchard and Dory Funk Jr. were training guys in the warehouse at the TV studio. I said, all right, this could probably be done better. And that's how I was able to get out and go to Louisville, the happiest day of my life. I pitched to Jim Ross. I said, they can pay me half what they're paying me now. I will move to Louisville and run this thing and book it. Let me get the fuck out of here. Pitch this to Vince. And he came through with it.
Crazy, because a lot of people obviously would die to work for Vince, or they would love working.
Well, and I'm not even saying I was hating working for Vince. I was hating living in Connecticut working for Vince 24 hours a day, because that will get old real fucking quick. Vince was very nice to me at that period of time, so I'm not knocking him. But I never wanted to live in that fucking overpriced hellhole, as Jim Ross said in that promo, because he was the same way. Everybody that came from down south, it's like, what the fuck? The traffic, the fucking prices, the goddamn, it's hard to do anything. People are like, Ricky Morton went to New York first time we were working for Crockett. He went to New York and he came in the next day in the locker room. He said, fuck. He said, I need to get back home. I said, what do you mean? He went into a convenience store and there was an old woman walking up behind him. So he pushed the door open and stopped and stepped back to let her go through. And she looked at him like he was going to hit her over the fucking head. They're not used to people being nice. It wasn't home. I love my fans in Connecticut, but it wasn't home. And JR felt the same way. Jerry Jarrett, when he came up to, when Vince was going to go to jail, he was going to run the thing. And He said he was up to drinking 2 bottles of wine a night in the apartment they got him till he could get back to Nashville. It just, everybody has always had that reaction. So, yeah, it would have been a lot of the thing that a lot of people want to do, but I wanted territory wrestling has always been my thing. I didn't want to travel all over the goddamn world. I wanted to territory wrestling was my thing. And the last place I wanted to be was in Connecticut on that fucking parkway, an hour and a half a day, going back and forth to an office that I actually worked in the office. I went to an office every day for like a year and a half. And it was fucking brutal. Because you can't get any work done working in a wrestling office. I'd go home. I'd take all my work and do it at home, because the real with calling promoters and calling talent and fucking sitting with goddamn stacks of paper surrounding you, working on fucking ideas for TV and TV formats and shit. You don't do that shit in an office. You only work in an office when you're in a real company, Pinocchio, and that doesn't mix with wrestling.
Now, the actual tape library of Smoky Mountain, you sold it all to Vince at WWF? Because you see it on the WWE Network now.
I did. They have it all, and they've been very slow, let's say, to roll it out. I think it's 14 years ago I sold it to them. Well, and I finally made a profit on Smoky Mountain Wrestling after all those years by doing that. But, I wish they would, because, there's so much good stuff there, but now people are just saying, fuck it. We sold videotapes of the show when it was in production on subscription to the fans around the country that couldn't get it, via over the air signal because they didn't live in the territory. So it's all out there, and people are putting stuff up on YouTube, and it gets tons of views, and they like it. And now people are calling it, as the last of the territories, and are having they're rediscovering it for the first time, if that makes any sense, because now when you look back on it with eyes from 2018, it's like, my God, this shit's great. At the time, it was real good wrestling, but it wasn't anything outstanding. But now the level of wrestling has gone down so far that people now look and go, and I'm not talking about the level of athleticism, by the way, or people say, wow, that was the greatest match ever with Kenny Omega and the blow-up doll, and the athleticism is better than ever. The guys are doing a lot more shit. The wrestling sucks, because my criteria for wrestling is not how much you can do, but whether or not what you do gets over, and whether the audience that is watching it is into it. And you know as well as I do that now that everybody looks at wrestling with jaded eyes, they politely applaud for a move that might paralyze somebody, whereas the right guy snatching a headlock, they used to come out of their chairs and throw the babies in the air. Because they're looking now at a performance rather than cheering for their guy to win a fight, and it's a whole different outlook.
That's very true. That classic Bobby Eaton punch you get more over than somebody doing like a package pile driver through a table.
Well, yeah, because it looked like it really, A, really hurt you, and B, you were into what the guys were doing as far as following it as a contest instead of seeing what move they were going to do next. And that's what today's modern fans have missed out on, because they're too young to have experienced that emotion in the arenas. They're too young to have experienced the atmosphere and to know what the stuff, felt like. So now they just go and they think, oh, this is something to do for fun and a giggle. And look, oh, they're doing interesting moves. Nobody's going to start a riot unless maybe they book Vince Russo on another card. Then the people start carrying pitchforks.
Now, as we start to wind it down here, with you, it's like impossible, because when I put together a run sheet or something, there's almost too much information on it. It's just because you've done so much in the business, you've literally worked everywhere. I'm just curious with Midnight Express, just a couple, little things with them. Obviously, one of the greatest tag teams of all time, if not the greatest tag team. I love Condrey and Eaton, but my favorite is Eaton and Lane. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you your favorite because it's going to be impossible. But as far as teams that you worked, is there some teams that stick out more than others? I mean, obviously, Rock and Roll Express is probably going to be number one, but is there some teams that were, your favorites to work more so than others?
Oh, God. Well, definitely along with the Rock and Roll, the Fantastics. we just fit with Bobby and Tommy so good because, and especially Tommy Rogers was so underrated as an athlete. He was so athletic and his work was so crisp and so perfect and light. And then Bobby Fulton, I've told him a million times, he's a classic overachiever because he really athletically shouldn't have been working at the level that he was, but he just worked so hard and he loved the wrestling business that he overachieved. Um, so the Fantastics were great to work with, and we had great matches with the Road Warriors. And a lot of people, have the impression of the Road Warriors from the '80s as this team that didn't sell anything and steamrolled people. If you go back and watch the Midnight Express matches, they sell more for the Midnight Express, whether it's Eaton and Condrey or Eaton and Lane, than almost any other team. And they both would go down, and they both would sell, and because we did it right. We always cheated, or we always 2-on-1, or used the racket from behind, or whatever, and didn't make them look bad like they were just getting beat up. And then we always flew for them on the comeback. And the formula that people tried with the Road Warriors was once they got over so good, they kept trying to find teams that were as big as and bad, like the Clash of the Giants, like the the Russians, or then later on the Powers of Pain. But if you notice, the Road Warriors worked best, drew best, against a little heel team that had so much heat that people wanted to see them get killed. Tully and Arn and the Midnight Express. Throw them off scaffold. They legitimately the fans wanted to see us die. Beat up the Horsemen, fucking hit JJ with the thing, whatever. The smaller teams with heat worked against the Road Warriors more than the big teams that could match up to them physically. And there was so many great teams. I mean, we enjoyed working with the Mulkey brothers, for God's sake. People still remember that. But the Garvin brothers, or Ronnie Garvin and Barry Windham was another underrated team. That Barry Windham at the time was the smoothest guy in the ring in the business, and he and Bobby would have incredible matches just on spot shows. They would do shit like having a match on their knees just to give themselves a handicap, and they were still smoother than everybody else. But literally, Barry Windham would get a headlock, and they'd go down to their knees, and then Bobby would shove him off into the rope, and he'd give Bobby a tackle while they were still on their knees, and then they'd drop kick and hip toss and everything. It was insane, but they were so good, and the people didn't know any difference. They didn't know what they were doing. So there were a lot of great teams that we worked with, and everybody, I think, tried to up their game when they were in with the Midnight because they knew they were going to look like $1 million if they did.
I love that you mentioned the Mulkeys there, because I was almost thinking about them as like a forgotten great, enhancement, jobber team, whatever you want to call it. Always had good matches with Midnight. It's interesting. I think it's impossible to not have a good match with those guys, right? More so than anything. It's almost like you can't not have a good match with the Midnight Express.
Well, yeah, and part of it is because all those guys, they were great tag team wrestlers. Dennis had been in a long-term team with Phil Hickerson. Bobby had been in a number of teams, Coco Ware and George Goulas. So he learned how to carry the majority of the match. Dennis Condrey was insane with his ring generalship and body language. Stan Lane had been a member of the Fabulous Ones and worked at a high level. And, the point is, they didn't go out to just have their match. They figured out, what can we do to make this guy look good? Even if some cases, if he wasn't that good, and once the people are behind him, then we can do our shit and the people will be with it. But if the people didn't like your opponent or weren't behind your opponent, then you couldn't take them anywhere.
Now, obviously, we've talked about this before, but you gave me a great keepsake in that Midnight Express book. It's one of my prized possessions, that 25th anniversary scrapbook. Awesome book. I know they're out of print. I know they're impossible to get, but I'm just wanted to just say, not to promote it, to say, I have it, but such an awesome thing. I know it's basically impossible. You can't get it anymore, but I remember you telling me that you had a certain amount of them. You put them up, you sold them out, and then you sold more than you ever thought you would. So you almost had to pull it because they were selling faster than you actually had.
Well, no, what happened was we had found a box in the closet, right? And I said, okay, I'm going to save these for a special occasion. And I saw the boys, so I had the boys sign them at WrestleCade last year. Bob Eaton and Stan Lane both signed them. And I announced on my show, I'm going to put them up on my website Monday morning at such and such a time Eastern. They'll be available. We've only got like 17 of them. So, jump in early. And I put the inventory number in my website, but we found out that if everybody logs on at the same time and tries to buy something, it just buffaloes the inventory feature. And my wife and I put it up, and then like 1 minute later, we're sitting there, all of a sudden it goes bing, 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 bing. And I'm like, hey, they're going to all sell out. And then they keep going bing, bing. I'm like, stop it. And we oversold. We sold like 27 of them. I had to refund some money, et cetera, et cetera. But it goes to show people are interested. The same thing I hope will happen with Behind the Curtain. We're going to make a collector's item out of that thing. I've got another, actually a book contract with another publisher for something in 2019. I think we're going to do a cool thing with. We're working on a new video project. Just, things that I can do for the people who like that kind of thing. These are the kind of things that those people are going to like. And that's what keeps me busy.
And that's what you've always got something going. And that's what we love about you, that we can get you on and talk about whatever's going on in the world of Jim Cornette. But before we let you go, before we get to the last plug here for the graphic novel, I got to give you my Barbara Walters Inside the Actors Studio question. And that is, at the end of the day, what's the biggest misconception of James E. Cornette?
Oh gosh, I need to sharpen my pencil. People, there's a misconception that I'm crazy, except in some cases I am, because pretty much if you're in the wrestling business, you're crazy. Either you get in the wrestling business because you're crazy, or you get in the wrestling business and the crazy people in it make you crazy. There's the misconception that I'm always mad and angry about something just because I'm a passionate person. And when I say good things about people, nobody ever reports it or ever talks about it. Or actually, they ignore it and they just say, "Oh, he was always knocking that guy anyway." So I'm passionate, good and bad. When I really like something, I rave about it for a week and a half. Right? It's just that nobody, like I said, likes to report on the good stuff. So they think I'm always mad. I'm not. When I do get mad, I tend to play with my puppy, little Harley Quinn. She gives me puppy kisses on my cheek, and I rub her belly, and she's my little furry Xanax. It makes me feel better. But I would say there's the misconception that I hate wrestling. I don't hate wrestling. I've loved wrestling all my life. I just hate the shit that passes for wrestling these days. I don't know. There's a lot of, I've been misconceived in a lot of ways. And I think possibly what I'm going to have to do is just start a program where I take people in, maybe 10 or 12 of them at a time, and let them live with me for a week or two and fall in love with me as I really am and see the real Jim Cornette behind the veneer of the showbiz front. Maybe that's what I'll do, or maybe not.
And if they don't believe in that, then you could just hit them with a tennis racket on the way out and give them a good stiff kick in the ass.
Exactly. And you know what they say? It's only a couple of feet difference between a pat on the back and a kick in the pants, baby.
Absolutely. Now, as we wrap it up here, Jim, if we can, please give one more pitch here for the graphic novel. Obviously, over 1,000 people backed it in 24 hours. The Kickstarter was funded, but please share with the fans, listeners of the Two-Man Power Trip, everything going on in the world of Jim Cornette and where we can find all the information about that graphic novel, Jim Cornette's Real Pro Wrestling Stories.
Oh my gosh, go to tinyurl.com/corny Kickstarter. You've still got time, less than 24 hours, but you still got time for Behind the Curtain. Listen to the Jim Cornette Experience every Thursday and Jim Cornette's Drive-Thru every Monday, wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Go to jimcornette.com for the very few select live appearances that I'll be making this year, because I just don't have time, as well as Cornette's Collectibles and all the merchandise, where you can get everything from action figures, books, DVDs, restraining orders, T-shirts, and so much more. And don't forget, whatever you do, always remember and never forget, Jim Cornette is the leader of the cult of Cornette, and I couldn't do it without the cult. So pat yourselves on the back for listening to me drone on for the past hours.
Absolutely. We always love having you on, and obviously, if John can bamboozle you in about 6 months and we'll get you back for number 5, obviously, then our job is done as interviewers. But we always thank you so much. We always have a lot of fun, and the door's always open for you to come back.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. And don't let the door hit me in the ass on the way out, right? Well, in that case, thank you. Fuck you. Bye.